The Great Hall of the Galactic Concord was filled with silence. Over 300 alien species had sent their ambassadors to this place. They came from worlds of ice and fire. They came from planets where the sky burned purple and the oceans were made of acid. They had conquered the stars. They had lived for millions of years. And today, they had gathered to discuss one small blue planet orbiting a boring yellow sun. Ambassador Eth of the Dominion stood at the center of the hall. Her skin was pale blue and her eyes were completely black. She had served the Dominion for over 200 years. She had seen many species rise and fall. Today, she would present the findings on a new one. "Fellow members of the Concord," she began, her voice echoing through the massive chamber. "Our observation drones have completed their study of the planet designated Sol 3. The local inhabitants call it Earth." A holographic image appeared above her. It showed a small world covered in blue oceans and green and brown land. Clouds swirled across its surface. To most of the aliens in the room, it looked like a dangerous place, a wild place. "The dominant species calls themselves humans," Eth continued. "They are carbon-based life forms with an average of approximately 80 standard years." A murmur went through the crowd. 80 years? Some of the species in this room lived for thousands of years. Some were effectively immortal. 80 years was nothing. It was barely enough time to learn how to think properly. "Their biology is fragile," Eth said. "They require constant intake of water and organic matter to survive. They must sleep for approximately 1/3 of their short lives. Their bodies are vulnerable to temperature changes, radiation, disease, and physical trauma. They have no natural armor, no claws, no venom. They cannot regenerate lost limbs. A fall from a moderate height can kill them." The murmuring grew louder. Several ambassadors laughed openly. The Ani representative, a massive creature covered in scales and spines, shook his head in disbelief. "And yet," Eth said, raising her hand for silence, "they have somehow become the dominant species on their planet, a planet that our classification system designates as a Category 4 death world." The laughter stopped. Death worlds were rare. They were planets where everything seemed designed to kill any life that dared to exist there. Most intelligent species evolved on calm, stable worlds. The idea that a civilization could develop on a death world was almost unbelievable. "Their planet experiences extreme weather events," Eth explained. "Massive storms, floods, droughts, and temperature swings. The ground itself moves and shakes, destroying their structures. Mountains explode with liquid rock. The planet is filled with predatory animals, poisonous plants, and microscopic organisms that invade their bodies and cause disease. And despite all of this, the humans have spread across every corner of their world." She paused for effect. "However, they have not yet developed faster-than-light travel. They have only recently left their own planet, and their exploration has been limited to their immediate solar neighborhood. They are centuries, perhaps thousands of years, away from joining the galactic community." The Ani ambassador raised one of his massive clawed hands. "Then why are we discussing them at all? They are primitives. Let them develop in peace or let their death world kill them. Either way, they are not our concern." Eth smiled. It was not a kind smile. "I agree completely, but I wanted to share something fascinating with the assembly, something that perfectly illustrates the nature of this species." She waved her hand and the holographic display changed. Now it showed a large ship floating on water. It was made of metal, and it was enormous by human standards. The design was crude but showed a certain primitive elegance. "This is a human water vessel from approximately 100 of their years ago. They called it the Titanic. It was the largest ship they had ever built. They filled it with their wealthy and powerful individuals for a voyage across one of their oceans." The aliens watched with mild curiosity. Water vessels were primitive technology, but it was interesting to see how the humans had developed. "The humans made a remarkable claim about this ship," Eth said. "They declared it to be unsinkable. They believed they had built something that could not be destroyed by their planet's oceans." She paused again, letting the words hang in the air. "On its very first voyage, the ship struck a piece of frozen water floating in the ocean. It sank in less than 3 of their hours. Over 1,500 humans died." The hall erupted in laughter. The sound echoed off the ancient walls as hundreds of alien species shared in the joke. A species that declared something unsinkable, only to have it sink immediately. It was too perfect. It was too absurd. Eth waited for the laughter to die down. I propose that we create a new classification for species like this. Species that display extreme overconfidence despite obvious limitations. Species that are clearly doomed to destroy themselves through their own foolishness. I propose we call it the Titanic Protocol. The vote was unanimous. Earth and its human inhabitants were officially classified under the Titanic Protocol. They would be ignored. They would be quarantined. The conquered would place warning beacons around their solar system to prevent any accidental contact. And then the galaxy would simply wait for them to destroy themselves, as all such species eventually did. The file on humanity was closed and archived. The assembly moved on to more important matters: trade disputes, border conflicts, the usual business of running a galaxy. No one paid any attention to the small human satellite drifting silently past the observation drones. It was a simple machine, launched decades ago, designed to travel beyond the edge of their solar system. The aliens had dismissed it as primitive junk, not worth examining. They did not notice the advanced sensors hidden inside its hull. They did not notice that it was recording everything, every transmission, every frequency, every piece of data it could capture about the aliens who had just laughed at humanity and declared them doomed. The satellite continued on its path, moving deeper into the darkness between stars. And far behind it, on the small blue planet called Earth, a team of scientists watched their screens with wide eyes as the data began to arrive. They had wondered if they were alone in the universe. Now they knew the truth. They were not alone, and the universe had already decided they were a joke. The scientists looked at each other in silence. Then one of them, a young woman with fire in her eyes, spoke the words that would change everything. "They think we are already dead. Let us show them what the dead can do." The others nodded, and humanity began to prepare. 47 years passed in the galaxy. Empires grew, empires fell, trade routes shifted, wars were fought and forgotten. And through it all, the small blue planet called Earth remained quarantined and ignored. The file on humanity gathered dust in the conquered's archives. No one thought about the Titanic species anymore. Then the swarm came. They emerged from the darkness at the edge of the galaxy, where no civilization had ever traveled. At first, the outer colonies thought it was a natural phenomenon, a cloud of asteroids perhaps, or a strange energy field. But then the cloud moved. It changed direction. It headed straight for the nearest inhabited world. The colony of Prime was the first to fall. It happened so fast that no one truly understood what was happening. One moment there were 3 million people living their lives. The next moment there was only silence. When rescue ships arrived, they found nothing but bare rock. Every building was gone. Every tree was gone. Every drop of water had been consumed. It was as if the planet had been stripped down to its bones. The swarm was not a species in the normal sense. It was a force of nature. Billions upon billions of creatures, each one designed for a single purpose. Some were small, no bigger than an insect, and they ate everything organic they could find. Some were massive, larger than starships, and they carried the smaller ones between the stars. And at the center of it all was the swarm mother, an intelligence older than most civilizations, driving her children forward in an endless hunger. No one knew where the swarm came from. No one knew why it consumed everything in its path. All anyone knew was that it could not be stopped. The Dominion sent its fleet to intercept the swarm. They were proud warriors. They had conquered half a galaxy. Their ships were the finest ever built. They believed they could destroy this threat and return home as heroes. The battle lasted less than a day. The swarm did not fight like normal enemies. It did not care about losses. For every creature that died, 10 more took its place. The swarm ships were not ships at all but living things, and they healed themselves even as they attacked. The fleet was overwhelmed, surrounded, and consumed. Not destroyed. Consumed. The swarm ate the ships and the people inside them and used the raw materials to make more of itself. Ambassador Eth received the news on her home world. She stood in her garden looking up at the stars and felt something she had never felt before in her 250 years of life. She felt true fear. The Dominion fell in 18 months. Every world, every colony, every station. Gone. Eth escaped on the last ship to leave the capital, watching through the viewport as her home planet was covered in a living carpet of swarm creatures. She could see them eating the cities. She could see them drinking the oceans. The collective have tried a different strategy. They were a peaceful species, scientists and philosophers. They attempted to communicate with the swarm. They sent messages of friendship. They offered to share their knowledge. The The swarm did not respond. It simply arrived at their worlds and began feeding. The collective lasted 9 weeks. The Ani Empire was the greatest military power in the known galaxy. They ruled over 2,000 worlds. Their warriors were legendary. Their emperor declared that the swarm would break against the might of the Ani like water against stone. The emperor was wrong. The Ani fought bravely. They won some battles, but the swarm learned from every fight. It adapted. It evolved. Weapons that worked one day were useless the next. Tactics that succeeded once never worked again. Slowly, system by system, the empire crumbled. The final transmission from the Ani showed the emperor himself, standing on the steps of his palace as swarm creatures poured through the streets behind him. His scales were burned. His armor was broken, but he stood tall. "We die with honor," he said. "Remember us." Then the transmission ended, and the Ani were no more. The Galactic Concord, once a union of over 300 spacefaring civilizations, was reduced to 47 desperate remnants within a decade. Their fleets were shattered. Their worlds were ash. Their hope was gone. The survivors gathered what ships they could and fled, always staying one step ahead of the endless hunger behind them. Eth now commanded the last warship. There were only 3,000 of her people left, 3,000 out of billions. She spent her days staring at sensor screens, watching the swarm spread across the galaxy like a disease. One day, her navigation officer reported a course change. The main body of the swarm was turning. It was heading toward a region of space that had been marked with warning beacons and quarantine signs. It was heading toward Sol System, toward Earth. Eth felt something strange twist in her chest. She remembered the day she had stood before the Conquered and laughed at the humans. She remembered calling them Titanics. She remembered voting to ignore them and let them destroy themselves. Now they would be destroyed anyway, not by their own foolishness, but by a horror that had consumed half the galaxy. They would die without ever knowing why, without ever having a chance to fight, without ever knowing that other life existed in the universe. It was not fair. Nothing about this was fair. But Eth had learned that the universe did not care about fairness. She made a decision. It would not save the humans. Nothing could save them now. But at least they would know the truth before the end. "Send a warning transmission to Sol 3, she ordered. "Tell them what is coming. Tell them everything." Her communications officer looked at her with surprise. "Ambassador, the quarantine protocols forbid contact with Titanic species." Eth laughed. It was a bitter sound, empty of joy. "The quarantine means nothing now. The Conquered means nothing now. Everything we built is gone. At least let the humans know what killed them. It is the least we can do." The message was sent. It traveled at faster-than-light speeds, carrying everything they knew about the swarm. Its origins, its capabilities, its weaknesses, if any existed. And a simple warning: you have 14 hours. There is nothing you can do. We are sorry. Eth watched the transmission leave and felt the guilt settle into her bones. She had laughed at the humans. She had called them doomed. And now she was delivering their death sentence. She turned away from the screen and prepared to watch another species die. She had no idea what was waiting for her. The remnant fleet hid in the shadow of a dead moon, far enough from Earth to be safe but close enough to watch. 47 species, reduced to a few thousand ships, gathered to witness the death of another world. It was a grim tradition now. There was nothing else they could do. Eth stood at the observation deck of her ship, her black eyes fixed on the distant blue dot that was Earth. The swarm would arrive in hours. She wondered if the humans had even received her warning. She wondered if it mattered. "Ambassador," her sensor officer called out, "I am detecting unusual activity in the Sol system." Eth turned. "What kind of activity?" "Energy signatures, thousands of them. They appear to be weapon systems." Eth walked to the sensor station and looked at the display. Her eyes widened. "That is impossible." According to every record the Conquered had, humans possessed no orbital weapons. They had barely managed to put a few primitive space stations in orbit. They were still using chemical rockets to leave their planet. They should have had nothing. But the sensors did not lie. The space around Earth was lighting up with power signatures. Hidden platforms were coming online, revealing themselves after decades of secrecy. Satellites that had looked like communication relays were unfolding into weapons platforms. Stations disguised as civilian structures were powering up military-grade reactors. The humans had been building in secret. For 47 years, while the galaxy ignored them, they had been preparing. "How did we miss this?" Eth whispered. Her officer shook his head. "They hid it well, they knew we were watching." The first swarm wave entered the Sol system like a dark cloud. Millions of creatures, ranging from small fighters to massive carrier beasts. They moved with terrible purpose, heading straight for Earth. They had consumed hundreds of worlds. This small planet would be no different. Then Earth opened fire. The orbital defense grid activated simultaneously. Thousands of weapons platforms unleashed everything they had. Nuclear missiles, kinetic projectiles, energy beams. The wall of fire was so bright that the sensors had to adjust to avoid being blinded. The first wave of swarm creatures died by the millions. Their bodies broke apart and burned in the void. For a moment, it looked like the impossible might happen. It looked like the humans might actually stop them. But the swarm was endless. The second wave came right behind the first, using the burning corpses of their brothers as shields. The third wave was already entering the system, and behind them, more and more, stretching back into the darkness of space like an infinite river of death. The orbital defenses kept firing. They destroyed millions of swarm creatures, but millions more took their place. Slowly, inevitably, the creatures began to break through. They swarmed around the weapons platforms and tore them apart. They crashed into the defense stations and ate through the hulls. And then they reached Earth. The swarm landed on every continent. They fell from the sky like rain, billions of creatures descending on cities and forests and mountains. Eth watched the feeds with grim resignation. She had seen this before. She knew how it ended. But something strange happened. The humans did not run. They did not surrender. They did not beg for mercy. They fought. In the cities, soldiers held their positions even as the buildings fell around them. They fired their weapons until they ran out of ammunition, and then they fought with knives and fists and teeth. In the countryside, farmers formed militias and ambushed swarm columns. In the mountains, guerrilla fighters collapsed tunnels on top of enemy nests. And when conventional weapons failed, the humans used unconventional ones. They detonated nuclear bombs on their own soil. They poisoned their own rivers to deny the swarm water. They burned their own crops to starve the enemy. They sacrificed their own cities, their own homes, their own lives. Eth watched a pilot crash her aircraft directly into a swarm carrier. She watched soldiers charge into swarm nests with explosives strapped to their bodies. She watched a group of civilians form a human wall to buy time for others to escape, dying one by one as the creatures tore through them. The humans were dying, there was no question about that. Billions of them were dying, but they were taking the swarm with them. For every human that fell, 100 swarm creatures died. The cost was terrible, the cost was unimaginable, but they would not stop fighting. "This is madness," the Ani observer whispered. "Why do they not surrender? They cannot win." Eth did not answer. She could not take her eyes off the screens. For 3 days, the battle raged. The humans used every weapon, every tactic, every trick they had. They collapsed mountains on swarm hives. They flooded valleys to drown the creatures. They released diseases designed to target swarm biology. They fought in the ruins of their cities and the ashes of their forests. And then, on the third day, the transmissions stopped. Every signal from Earth went silent. The feeds cut out. The radio chatter disappeared. One moment the humans were screaming defiance into the void. The next moment there was nothing but silence. Eth stared at the blank screens. She had seen this before. She knew what it meant. The swarm had finally consumed Earth. Another species had fallen. Another world was dead. She lowered her head. Despite everything, she felt grief. The humans had fought harder than anyone she had ever seen. They had refused to accept defeat even when defeat was certain. They had died standing, not kneeling. "A brave people," she said quietly. "Foolish but brave, may they find peace." She turned away from the observation deck. And then her communications officer screamed. Eth spun around. "What is it?" The officer was staring at his console with an expression of pure shock. His hands were shaking. His voice was barely a whisper. "Ambassador, we are receiving a transmission from Earth." "That is impossible. The planet is dead." "Ambassador?" The officer looked up at her, and there was something new in his eyes, something that looked almost like hope. "The transmission is broadcasting on every frequency in the galaxy. It is using technology we have never seen. And Ambassador." He swallowed hard. It is not a distress call. Eth felt her hearts begin to beat faster. She walked toward the communications station. Around her, every officer on the bridge had stopped what they were doing. Every eye was fixed on the console. "Play it," she ordered. The transmission filled the bridge. 3 words in perfect galactic standard, broadcast with enough power to reach every corner of the known universe. The words were simple, the words were impossible, and the words changed everything. "Send more swarm?" The bridge of Eth's ship had gone completely silent. Every officer stood frozen, staring at the communications console as if it had suddenly turned into a dangerous animal. The 3 words hung in the air like thunder. "Send more swarm." Eth found that she had stopped breathing. She forced herself to inhale. Her mind was racing, trying to understand what she had just heard. "Is this a joke?" the Ani observer demanded. "Some kind of automated message, a malfunction?" "No," the communications officer said. His voice was shaking. "There is more. The transmission includes data packets, massive amounts of data." "Show me," Eth ordered. The holographic display activated, and information began to scroll across it. Eth read the first few lines and felt her legs grow weak. She grabbed the edge of the console to steady herself. The data contained coordinates, swarm fleet positions across the galaxy, current locations, projected movements, patrol patterns, all of it accurate, all of it updated in real time. "How do they have this information?" someone whispered. Eth kept reading. The next section was a complete biological analysis of swarm creatures. Genetic structures, metabolic processes, reproductive cycles, weaknesses, so many weaknesses. Things the Conquered had tried to discover for decades, laid out in simple, clear terms. "They studied them," she said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. "In 3 days, they captured specimens and studied them. They learned more about the swarm than we did in 10 years. The data continued. Weapon schematics, designs for new missiles that could penetrate swarm armor, biological agents that could infect and kill swarm creatures, energy frequencies that disrupted their communication, everything a fleet would need to fight back." And at the bottom of the transmission, there was a final message. Eth read it out loud, her voice growing stronger with each word. "We have captured 17 hive queens. We have reverse-engineered their communication frequencies. We know how they coordinate, we know how they think, we know where the swarm mother nests. She has hidden in the void nebula for 10,000 years. We have found her." She paused, letting the words sink in. "If you want to survive, follow us. We will show you how to fight. We will show you how to win. The swarm is not invincible. It can be destroyed. We will prove it." The message ended with a simple signature: United Earth Defense Command. The bridge erupted into chaos. Officers shouted questions at each other. Some demanded to know how this was possible. Others insisted it must be a trap, a trick by the swarm to lure them into an ambush. The Ani observer was pounding his fist against a console, roaring that this was madness. Eth ignored them all. She was still reading the data, her mind slowly accepting what she was seeing. The humans had not just survived, they had won. Not easily, not without cost. The data included casualty reports. 3 billion humans had died in the battle for Earth. 3 billion. Nearly a third of their entire species gone in 3 days. Cities had been vaporized, continents had been. The planet would take centuries to recover. But the swarm had lost more, much more. The humans had killed over 40 billion swarm creatures. They had destroyed every carrier beast that reached their world. They had captured 17 hive queens, something that no other species had ever managed to do even once. And they had done something else, something that Eth had to read 3 times before she believed it. They had cracked the swarm's communication network. The swarm mother controlled her children through a psychic link, a web of signals that connected every creature across the galaxy. The humans had found a way to listen to that network. They could hear the swarm mother's commands. They knew what she was planning before her creatures did. "This is why they went silent," Eth said softly. "They were not dying, they were learning." "Ambassador, this is insane," the Ani observer said. He had finally stopped shouting. "These are Titanic-class primitives. They had no space navy. They had no faster-than-light travel. How could they possibly have done this?" Eth turned to face him. For the first time in years, she felt something other than fear and despair. She felt hope. "We underestimated them," she said. We looked at their short lives and called them primitive. We looked at their fragile bodies and called them weak. We looked at their failed ships and called them foolish. But we missed something important. She pointed at the data still scrolling across the display. They have been fighting their entire existence. Their planet tried to kill them every day and they survived. They fought each other for thousands of years and they learned from every battle. They are not strong despite their weakness. They are strong because of it. They had to be. A new transmission came through. This time it was a visual feed. The display showed a room filled with humans. They were wearing military uniforms covered in dust and blood. Many had bandages. Some were missing limbs, but they stood tall and their eyes were hard. A woman stepped forward. She had gray hair and a face full of scars. Her left arm was replaced with a mechanical prosthetic. When she spoke, her voice was calm and steady. "This is Admiral Way of the United Earth Defense Command. We know you are watching. We know you have been watching us for a long time. We know you called us Titanics. We know you thought we would destroy ourselves." She paused and smiled. It was not a friendly smile. "You were wronged." Behind her, the other humans stood. Some of them were smiling, too. The swarm came to our world expecting an easy meal. Instead, they found something they had never encountered before. A species that would rather die than surrender. A species that adapts faster than they do. A species that has been preparing for this fight since before we knew you existed. She leaned closer to the camera. "We are done hiding. We are done waiting. We know where the swarm mother is. We know how to kill her. And we are going to do it with or without your help." Her eyes seemed to look directly at Ed through the screen. "But it would be easier with your help. We have ships, but not enough. We have weapons, but not enough. We have soldiers ready to fight, but the galaxy is big and we are just one species. Join us. Bring your fleets, bring your warriors. We will lead the attack. We will take the losses. All we ask is that you fight beside us." Admiral Wei straightened up and delivered her final words. "The swarm has been winning because you have been fighting alone. That ends now. Humanity is going to war. The only question is whether you will come with us." The transmission ended. Eth looked around the bridge. Every face was pale. Every eye was wide. For 10 years they had been running. For 10 years they had watched their homes burn and their people die. For 10 years they had waited for the end. Now, for the first time, someone was offering them a chance to fight back. "Ambassador," her navigation officer said quietly, "what do we do?" Eth thought about her home world, consumed by the swarm. She thought about the billions of her people who had died. She thought about all the species that had been erased from existence. Then she thought about the humans, 3 billion dead, and they were still ready to fight, not just ready, eager. She made her decision. "Set course for Earth," she ordered. "We are joining the war." The final battle for the galaxy took place in the shadow of a dying star. The Void Nebula was a place of darkness and death. Ancient radiation storms swept through its clouds. Gravity wells from collapsed stars pulled at anything that came too close. No civilization had ever mapped its depths. No explorer had ever returned from its center. But the humans had found a way. Their stolen knowledge from the swarm's communication network had led them here, to a place where the swarm mother had hidden for 10,000 years. She had sent her children out to consume galaxy after galaxy, always returning to this dark nest to birth more. Kill her and the swarm would fall apart. The psychic link would break. The creatures would become mindless, easy to destroy. The combined fleet gathered at the edge of the nebula. 43 species had answered humanity's call. Ships of every shape and size floated together, their weapons charged, their crews ready. It was the largest military force ever assembled in galactic history. And at the front of that fleet, leading the charge, were the human ships. They were ugly by conquered standards, blocks of welded metal covered in weapons. No elegant curves or artistic designs. They looked like they had been built in a hurry by people who cared more about function than form. But they moved with a speed and aggression that made the other captains nervous. Admiral Wei stood on the bridge of her flagship, the unsinkable II. It was a name that many aliens found amusing. The humans did not laugh. They understood what the name meant. It was not arrogance. It was defiance. "All ships report status," Wei ordered. The reports came in from across the fleet. Weapons ready, shields charged, crews prepared. Everyone knew this was the end. Either they destroyed the swarm mother today or the galaxy would fall. "Take us in," the admiral said. The fleet entered the nebula like a spear thrown into darkness. The swarm was waiting for them. Creatures poured out of the clouds in numbers beyond counting. They had been gathering here for protecting their mother, carrier beasts the size of moons, fighter swarms that blocked out the stars, hive ships that screamed psychic rage across every frequency. The battle began, and it was chaos. Ships exploded in silence. Creatures died by the millions. Energy beams cut through the darkness. Missiles left trails of fire across the void. The fleet pushed forward step by bloody step toward the heart of the nebula. The human ships were always at the front. They took the worst of the damage. They absorbed attacks meant for their allies. When an Ani cruiser was about to be overwhelmed, a human destroyer rammed into the swarm creatures surrounding it, sacrificing itself to save the larger ship. Eth watched from her command station as human pilots flew into impossible situations. They did not seem to fear death. They seemed to welcome it, as long as their deaths meant something. She heard their communications, their voices calm even as their ships burned around them. Hull breach on Deck 7, continuing attack. Engines failing, switching to manual control. I can get one more run in. Tell my family I did my job. The aliens had called them Titanics. Now they understood what that meant. The humans knew they were fragile. They knew they were mortal, and they fought harder because of it. Every moment was precious. Every life mattered. Every death had to count. The fleet broke through the outer defenses. They entered the core of the nebula, and there, waiting for them, was the swarm mother. She was enormous, a creature of nightmare, larger than a small planet, her body covered in billions of smaller creatures that served as her armor and her weapons. She had existed for longer than most stars. She had consumed more life than any disaster in history. And now she looked upon the tiny ships approaching her with something like amusement. The psychic attack hit the fleet like a wave. Alien crews screamed and collapsed. Ships lost control and crashed into each other. The swarm mother's mind was too powerful. No species could resist her. No species except one. The human ships kept coming. Their crews did not collapse. Their minds did not break. They had trained for this. They had developed mental shields, chemical treatments, neural implants. They had prepared for every possibility. Admiral Wei looked at the swarm mother through her viewport. The creature was ancient and terrible and powerful beyond imagination. She smiled. All human vessels, she said into her communicator. Full attack, target the central mass, everything you have. The human fleet charged. They fired every weapon. They launched every missile. They flew directly at the swarm mother, ignoring the creatures that tore at their hulls. Ships exploded. Crews died, but they did not stop. The unsinkable II led the charge. It took hit after hit, its armor peeling away, its systems failing one by one, but Wei held course. She had one final weapon, one final sacrifice. The ship's core was loaded with antimatter warheads, enough destructive power to crack a moon. She had always known this mission was one way. It was an honor, she said to her crew. They did not answer with words. They did not need to. They simply held their posts and waited for the end. The unsinkable II struck the swarm mother's central mass at full speed. The antimatter detonated. The explosion was visible from outside the nebula, a flash of light brighter than the dying star, a shockwave that scattered the clouds across light years, a psychic scream that silenced every swarm creature in the galaxy. The swarm mother died. Her children went mad, attacking each other, flying into stars, simply stopping and floating lifelessly. The threat that had consumed half the galaxy ended in a single moment of sacrifice. The war was over. Months later, the survivors gathered to rebuild. The Galactic conquered, reformed, smaller than before but determined to continue. And one of their first acts was to address the classification of humanity. Eth stood before the new assembly. She was older now, tired, but there was pride in her voice. I move to reclassify the species known as humans, she said. They are no longer Titanic protocol. They have proven themselves to be something far more significant. The assembly voted unanimously. Humanity was designated as apex persistent threat, a species that could not be stopped, could not be broken, could not be underestimated. When the human delegation arrived for the first time, the hall fell silent. Their ambassador was a young woman with one arm and eyes that had seen too much death. She walked to the center of the chamber and looked at the gathered aliens. You called us Titanics, she said. Because of a ship that sank, you thought it proved we were foolish, overconfident, doomed. She paused. But you missed the point. Yes, the Titanic sank. Yes, people died, but do you know what those people did as the ship went down? They played music. They gave their seats in lifeboats to strangers. They faced the cold and the dark and certain death, and they did it with dignity, with courage, with love for each other. Her voice grew stronger. We have always known we are fragile. We have always known the universe wants us dead. Our planet tries to kill us. Our bodies fail us. Our lives are short. We know all of this, but that is not our weakness. She looked around the room at the ancient, powerful species who had once laughed at humanity. That is why we fight so hard. Every moment matters. Every life matters. We cannot afford to give up. We cannot afford to surrender because we know how precious everything is. She smiled, and for the first time it reached her eyes. You thought Titanic meant doomed, but we taught you what it really means. It means facing the impossible and refusing to kneel. It means dying on your feet instead of living on your knees. It means standing in the darkness and playing music until the end. She straightened her uniform. Welcome to the new galaxy. Humanity is glad to be part of it, and we look forward to showing you what else you got wrong about us. The assembly was silent for a long moment. Then one by one the aliens began to stand. They did not applaud, for many species had no such custom. But they stood, a gesture of respect that crossed all cultural boundaries. Eth was the first to rise. She looked at the human ambassador and bowed her head. She had once called them Titanics as an insult. Now she understood it was the highest compliment.